I've spent thousands of hours researching, going through hundreds of biographies, and most importantly, sitting down one-on-one and asking questions to the people I was dying to get answers from. So as Eric mentioned, for business, I spoke to Bill Gates. For music, Lady Gaga. Science, Jane Goodall. Poetry, Maya Angelou. Steve Wozniak, Larry King, Quincy Jones, Jessica Alba. It's been this unbelievable journey filled with surprising lessons at every turn. And what I'm so excited about for today is to spend really the first half sharing some of the biggest lessons and some, in my opinion, the best stories from the journey, and spend the other half going really practical, spending all the time on Q&A and hearing really what you want to talk about. So to set up the context, I have to take you back 9 years. I was 18 years old, a freshman in college, and I was spending every day lying on my dorm room bed, staring up at the ceiling. So I just assumed there had to be a book with the answers. So I'm going to the library and just ripping through business books and biographies and self-help books, assuming there had to be a book with the answers. And what I was obsessed with wasn't a particular age in life, but more a stage. No matter what your goals are, no matter what your dream is, when no one's taking you seriously, no one's answering your calls, how do you find a way to break through? And eventually, I was left empty-handed. And that's when my naive 18-year-old thinking kicked in. I thought, well, if no one's written the book I'm dreaming of reading, why not write it myself? I thought it'd be super simple. I thought I would just call up Bill Gates, interview him, interview everybody else, and I'll be done in a few months. That I assumed would be the easy part. The hard part, I figured, was getting the money to fund the journey. I was buried in student loan debt. I was all out of bar mitzvah cash. So there had to be a way to make some quick money. So 2 nights before final exams, I was in the library doing what everyone does in the library right before finals. I'm on Facebook. And I'm on Facebook, and I see someone offering free tickets to The Price is Right. And again, so I can get a sense for the room. Who grew up really watching The Price is Right? Who really knows the show? Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to school in Los Angeles, not too far from the show filmed. And my first thought was, what if I go on this show and win some money to fund this book? Not my brightest moment. Plus, I had a problem. I'd never seen a full episode of the show before. Everyone's seen bits and pieces of The Price is Right when you're homesick from school in 4th grade, but I've never seen a full episode before, so I thought, this is an idiotic idea, and, I needed to focus back on my studies. I don't know if you guys have ever had one of those moments where an idea, no matter how preposterous it is, for some reason, you can't get it out of your head. So I remember I was at this round wooden table in the corner of the library, and I opened up my spiral notebook and wrote, best and worst case scenarios to prove to myself it was a bad idea. And I remember writing, worst case scenarios. Fail finals, get kicked out of pre-med, lose financial aid, mom stops talking to me, no, mom kills me. There's 20 cons. And the only pro was maybe win enough money to fund this dream. And it was almost as if somebody had tied a rope around my gut and was slowly pulling in a direction. So that night, I decided to do the logical thing and pull an all-nighter to study. But I didn't study for finals. I studied how to hack The Price is Right. And I went on the show the next day and did this ridiculous strategy and ended up winning the whole showcase showdown, winning a sailboat, selling the sailboat, and that's how I funded the book. Thank you very much. That is not how my mother responded when she found out. However, that's how the journey took off. It took, and you have to understand too, I'm 18 years old. I sold the sailboat for, I think, $16,000, which for a college student is $1 million. I remember taking all my friends to Chipotle, free guacamole for everyone. I was a baller now, And that's how it took off. It took 2 years to track down Bill Gates. It took 3 years to track down Lady Gaga. And when I had started this journey, there was no part of me looking for that one key to success. We've all seen those business books or those TED Talks, and normally I just roll my eyes, but what ended up happening over these 7 years of research and interviews is I started realizing that every single one of these people treats life and business and success the exact same way. And if any of you are into music, it was almost like there was this common melody. All the lyrics were different, but the melody was the same in every song. And the analogy that came to me, because I was 21 at the time, is that it's sort of like getting into a nightclub. There's always 3 ways in. So there's the first door, the main entrance, where the line curves around the block, where 99% of people wait around hoping to get in. That's the first door. You're just standing there holding your resume, hoping the bouncer lets you in. And then there's the second door, the VIP entrance, where the billionaires and celebrities go through. And for some reason, school and society have this way of making us feel like those are the only 2 ways in. You either wait your turn or you're born into it. But what I learned, and what I'm sure many of you in this room know, is there's always, always the third door. And it's the entrance where you jump out of line, run down the alley, bang on the door 100 times, crack open the window, go through the kitchen. There's always a way in. And it doesn't matter if that's how Bill Gates sold his first piece of software or how Lady Gaga got her first record deal. They all took the third door. So that's not only the title and the thesis of the book, that's really the energy I'm trying to share with the next generation. And, as I was, on my way here, and I was thinking a lot about, not only what unites everyone in this room, but really what one of the biggest traits across the board of this journey has been. Of course, one of, the main ideas is persistence, but I didn't really understand persistence until about halfway through this journey. And this story takes place, again, about halfway through, and what you have to understand about the third door is that it's not a random series of interviews. They're all tied together. And right before this situation, I had a disastrous situation with Warren Buffett. And it's a story for another time, but what you need to know is I ended up hacking his shareholders meeting in front of 30,000 people, but ended up, exploding in my face, and it was a complete disaster. And I found myself at the lowest point of my journey. One of those points where you can't really get yourself out of bed for, a week or 2. And, if there is one theme of this whole story, it's that when I found myself at my lowest points, it was always my best friends who pulled me back up. And I have this one best friend, his name is Corwin. And, he was trying to, get my energy up. He's like, come on, man, like, why don't we, go to a grocery store and get some sandwiches? He's trying to get my energy up. And, we go and we get these sandwiches, and we're sitting on the sidewalk. And, he's trying to get my energy up. And he's like, come on, like, don't you have any other interviews lined up? And I'm like, dude, I got nothing. And he's like, come on, let's say, you did have an interview lined up. Like, who would you want to talk to? And I'm like, I was just being really pissy. I was like, dude, even if I had an interview lined up, I'd probably mess that up too. Look at what happened with Warren Buffett. And Corn's like, look, you can't be so hard on yourself. Interviewing isn't a science, it's an art. And as we continue talking about this, the single most miraculous moment of the entire 7 years happened. A black car with tinted windows pulled up, parked right in front of us. The door swung open, and out walked Larry King. Now, if you are anything like me, when things align so perfectly like that, that's when I get the most scared. Like, I'm not kidding. I still can remember the feeling of, my throat tightening up, feeling like my mouth is wired shut, my feet turning to stone. And I literally am sitting there on the sidewalk, and I watch Larry King walk right past me, right into the grocery store's sliding doors, and I don't say a thing. And my friend Corin, jabs his elbow into me. He's like, dude, why didn't you say anything? And this is the thing about fear. It's very good at making logical excuses. And he's like, why didn't you say anything? I'm like, dude, he's probably, grabbing something for his family. I don't want to bother him. I don't want to be that guy. And he's like, man, you are that guy. And I'm like, And my fear keeps making excuses. I'm like, look, he's probably deep in the grocery store now. There's no way I'll be able to find him. And Corn's like, dude, he's 80 years old. How far could he get? So very reluctantly, almost so I don't look like an idiot in front of my friend, I get up and I start walking around this grocery store looking for Larry King. And I remember, I walk around the front in the bakery, no Larry. I jog over to the produce section. There's fruits, vegetables, no Larry. And that's when I had remembered he had parked in the loading zone. So he must be leaving any second now. And this bolt of adrenaline kicks in, and I start running down the grocery store looking for Larry King, looking down each aisle. No Larry, no Larry, no Larry, no Larry. I cut down the frozen food section, no Larry. So he has to be at the checkout counter. So I run to the checkout counter and look down each one. No Larry, no Larry, no Larry, no Larry. And at this point, I wanted to kick myself because he had been right in front of me. And I didn't say a thing. And I remember just walking out through the parking lot looking down at my feet. And I slowly lifted my head. And about 20 feet away from me, right where that back wall is, was Larry King, suspenders and all. And I don't know what got into me, but it was almost like this, all the pent-up frustration and emotion from the Warren Buffett situation was beginning to combust almost uncontrollably. And I started yelling at the top of my lungs, Mr. King! The echo in the parking lot was so loud. The poor guy has had quadruple bypass surgery. I will never forget for as long as I live him literally jumping up in the air and turning around like, like he's looking at the Grim Reaper. I'm like, oh, shoot. And, now I don't know what to do. So I'm like, running over to him. I'm like, Mr. King, my name's Alex. I'm 20 years old. I've always wanted to say hi. And he's like, okay, hi, and walks away. I'm like, oh, God. So, I'm thinking what to say. I don't know what to do. And, now I'm just like awkwardly following him out to his car. We're now literally, by the way, I do not recommend this to anyone. And, I'm walking out in front of his car. He's stuffing his groceries in the back, and he opens the front door, and I'm like, wait, Mr. King, can I go to breakfast with you? He looks at me like I'm a lunatic, but before he can respond, he looks out and sees there's about a dozen people on the sidewalk watching this go down, and very reluctantly, he just goes, okay. I'm like, oh my God, thank you so much. Like, I think he loves me now. I'm like, this is amazing. Thank you. Great, I'll see you tomorrow. And, he climbs into the car and he's about to shut the door. I'm like, wait, Mr. King, what time? And he just looks at me and slams the door shut. And I'm thinking maybe he didn't hear me. I'm like, Mr. King, what time? And he looks at me and just starts the engine. I am now standing in front of his car, waving my arm, shouting, Mr. King, what time? And he literally is like, 9 o'clock, and speeds off. So, the next morning comes around. It's 9 o'clock, and I walk in, to this, famous, bagel shop in LA, and there he is, sitting at this corner booth with his best friends. And there was actually an open seat at the table, but I had reflected the night before about how I had acted, and I thought today maybe I should be a bit more gentle. And, I walk over, and I'm like, hey, good morning, Mr. King. And he's just like, I'm like, okay, great. Maybe he needs a few minutes. So there was a table next to him that was open, and I thought, I'll sit at that table and wait for him to call me over. 5 minutes goes by, 30 minutes passes, an hour goes by, and he finally gets up and starts walking toward me. And, I can feel my cheeks lifting. And then he walks right past me and heads for the exit. And I sort of just put a hand up, and I was like, Mr. Mr. King? And he's like, what is it, kid? What do you want? And at this point, I felt a very, familiar pain in my chest, and I just looked at it, and I was like, honestly, I just wanted some advice on how to interview people. And this slow smile spreads across his face, almost as if to say, why didn't you say so? And he puts a hand on my shoulder and gives me the greatest monologue of interviewing advice I had ever heard. And then he looks up to the ceiling as if he's debating something in his mind. And then he looks back at me, and he sort of puts a finger in my face, and he's like, all right, tomorrow, 9 o'clock, see you here. And I show up the next morning at 9 o'clock. He waves me over to his table. He asked me why I even wanted to learn how to interview people. I tell him about the book. He's like, all right, I'm in. And over the course of the past 5 years, I've been to breakfast with him over 50 times. And, as great as the interview was with him, and it, taught me incredible lessons that changed my life. Over the course of these 7 years, many times, some of the biggest lessons I learned came along my way to get the interviews. And when I think back on, the key to persistence, no matter what your goal is, whether within your company or whether starting a company, no matter what your goal is, this lesson with persistence changed my life. And, almost as a side note, one of the things this journey gave me, in addition to, 7 years of, rejections and failure, was also many, many years in therapy. And one of the things I've learned in therapy is that there's a giant difference between implicit and explicit messages. There's a giant difference. So if you think back to your childhood, there's a big difference between implicit and explicit messages. So for example, an explicit message in your childhood is your mother saying, eat your vegetables. That's an explicit message. An implicit message is you wake up in the middle of the night and you see your mom eating chocolate ice cream in bed. That's the implicit message. And it's the implicit messages of our childhood that have the strongest hold on us. It's the implicit messages that have the strongest hold on us. And if you take it into a business context, let's say, your CEO says, we believe in innovation and risk-taking. That's the explicit message. But the second someone takes a risk and they're fired immediately, what's the implicit message? And which one do you think has the greatest impact on company culture? Now, going back to this Larry King situation, it made me realize, growing up, especially in America, we have wonderful explicit messages, especially when it comes to persistence. Try again, you can do anything. But let's say, you wanted to, be on the baseball team in, middle school or high school, and, you try out and you don't make it. People are like, come on, give it another shot. You go and you do it again and you still don't make it. Maybe you're super brave and you go try out, a third time and you still don't make it. What do the people who love you the most tell you? Maybe track and field. Maybe basketball. Those are the people who love you the most. Those aren't your haters or your enemies. Those are the people who love you the most who tell you that. And what I learned with this Larry King situation completely unraveled those implicit and explicit messages. What I learned when it comes to, business growth, success, and persistence, the reality is that you get as many at-bats as you're willing to give yourself. You have as many at-bats as you're willing to give yourself. And that's changed my life forever. Now, the next story that we'll dive into is definitively the one interview over these 7 years where I can confidently say I walked in one person and walked out another. And it completely changed my understanding of the relationship between success and failure. And the reason I love this story and this lesson so much is it doesn't matter what role in your organization you have. This is something that anyone can take back, not only to your own personal careers and your home life, but into any organization. So Again, this interview happened towards the end of the 7 years. And similar to the Larry King one, how it was sort of set up by that Warren Buffett situation, this interview, right before it, I had a really disastrous situation with Mark Zuckerberg. And again, it's a long story, but what you need to know is I ended up missing my meeting with him. They almost called the police on me, and it was my fault, and I beat myself up for months. You know, my insides were just black and blue. You know, we've all made that mistake that, 3 months every night you're just pounding yourself. How could I have done that? And that was sort of the state I was at the end of my journey. And the interview I was about to do was with Quincy Jones. Now, when I walked into Quincy Jones's house, I knew what a lot of people know about Quincy Jones. I knew he's undeniably one of the most successful music producers in history. He has more Grammy nominations than anyone in the entire music business. He, produced the best-selling album of all time, Thriller. He produced the best-selling single of all time, We Are the World. He worked with Frank Sinatra and Ray Charles. He, discovered Will Smith and Oprah Winfrey. He's undeniably one of the most important people in entertainment history. But the second I walked into his house, I realized I didn't know the half of it. So you have to understand, I'm sitting in his living room, and it's this, perfectly circular room with like gold lighting coming from the bottom. And, I'm sitting on the couch, and in walks in Quincy Jones. And, he's 80 years old, so he walks in very slowly, and he has, this velvet blue robe on with, gold stitching on the bottom, and, he looks like the alchemist. And he walks in, and he's like, "Where are you from, my man?" And I'm like, "Oh, hi, Mr. Jones. I'm from Los Angeles." And he goes, "No. I said, where are you from?" I'm like, is this a trick question? Like, I don't know where he's going with this. And I'm like, oh, my family's from Iran. And he's like, "That's what I thought." And he launches into a 30-minute story about dating a Persian princess, trying to break the Ayatollah out of prison. And he launches into the Quincy Jones vortex, and it is the happiest place on earth. Time stands still. He has a story for everything and anything. And, hours are going by, and he has stories about, the pyramids in Egypt and Rio's Carnival. And, I'm sitting there, and my head is spinning, and it is, again, the happiest place on earth. And about halfway through the Quincy Jones vortex, he tells me a story about when he was just starting out in the music industry. And this is really where that lesson came in that changed my life. So he's telling me about how when he was first starting out in the music industry, the entire industry was run by the mafia. And Quincy needed to get an original, he created an original composition, and he needed a publishing deal. So he goes into a meeting with a music executive. And of course, the executive is in the mob, and Quincy walks into the office, and the executive slides the contract across the table. And it says that Quincy's only going to get 1% of his own publishing. And the executive goes, "Look, you can ask for whatever you want, but you're only getting 1%. And behind him were all his cronies. And, I could feel my body tensing up just hearing this story. And Quincy was just, sitting there on the couch laughing as he's telling me. He's like, "Oh, man, they took all my stuff." And, I'm getting more and more tense. And he's like, "I'm still trying to get it back." And I'm just like, "That's messed up." He looks at me, very surprised why I would yell in the middle of the story. And only in hindsight can I see. I was still so, black and blue from that situation with Mark Zuckerberg that any story of a young person making a mistake and getting taken advantage like that was just setting me off. And Quincy began to look at me almost as if he understood something about me that I didn't. And he put a hand on my shoulder. And he said, "That's okay, man. It's how you learn." And it was almost as if my whole body was this overinflated tire, and he had just hit this escape valve, and all this excess pressure was rushing out. And he looked at me, and he goes, "Look, 99% of people hate their mistakes. They don't want to talk about their mistakes. They want to pretend they never happened. They treat their mistakes as their biggest enemy. And that's the biggest mistake you can make. Because it's only when you treat your mistakes as your best friends, it's only when you cherish them can you learn from them. And only then can you grow. Your mistakes are your best friend if you choose to make it so. And that was a great lesson, but the Quincy Jones vortex kept on going, and it's now been 3 hours, and I'm just sitting on the couch, and eventually I can feel the interview starting to slow down, and I just looked at him and I was like, Mr. Jones, I just have to tell you, this has changed my life. And he's like, that's so wonderful. How so? And I'm like, you taught me how to be a person of the world. You taught me how to grow. And he's like, amazing. In what way? I'm like, well, you told me that you can only really grow if you travel and explore. And he's like, no. You have to cherish your mistakes. And it was almost as if he wasn't going to let me leave that room until it finally sunk in. And in that moment, it did. And I remember having this epiphany just sitting there on his couch that I had spent 7 years assuming that the opposite of success is failure. Going back to the implicit and explicit messages, what's one of the biggest lessons we get, in kindergarten? The opposite of black is white, the opposite of up is down, the opposite of success is failure. And it wasn't until I sat there with Quincy Jones that I realized not only are success and failure not opposites, they're actually different results of the same thing. Trying. They're different sides of the same coin. So the opposite of success isn't failure. The opposite of success is not trying. And I remember sitting there and swearing to myself that from this point on, I would become unattached to succeeding and unattached to failing and instead be committed to trying and growing. And if there's one lesson, one thing I can share with you all today, it's that. And what I want to do for the rest of our time with together, we have about 30 minutes left, is really go into what you're dealing with. Any questions are on the table. We can talk about things that you're dealing with at work, things you're dealing with at home. We can talk about how I got my interviews, what I learned in the interviews, if my mother is still speaking to me. Everything's on the table, and my only request is the more raw, the more honest the questions, the more fun this is going to be. So I'll turn it over to you and just throw a hand up and I'll come on over. Yeah, what's your name, man? What was it? Eric. Everyone give Eric a round of applause. Good to meet you, man. What's your question?
So what did Larry King tell you when you asked him, how do you interview people?
Great question. So what was that interview monologue advice? So this is wonderful advice no matter what you do for your career. So everyone in this room probably does a lot of hiring. Everyone in this room probably does a lot of dealing with, different accounts. And at the end of the day, we're all doing interviews. We're all conducting interviews, whether you're hiring someone, whether you're trying to see who your, next supplier should be. You're really conducting an interview, whether you know it or not. And this advice with Larry King has helped me in all aspects of my life. And he looked at me, and, literally in 60 seconds, he encapsulated his entire career in 60 seconds. And he goes, look, every young interviewer who's just starting out, and again, he meant young not by an age, but really a stage. Anyone who's just starting out, they look at the interviewers they admire, and they try to study that. So, someone might look at Oprah Winfrey, who, injects a lot of emotion into her questions. Or you look at Barbara Walters, who has very strategically planned questions. Or they might look at, myself, Larry King. They, ask very simple, direct questions. And he said, that's the biggest mistake. Because they're focusing on what our methods is, not why we have those methods. And he said the key, the reason we have those methods is because it we realize after many years of trial and error, those are the methods that make us the most comfortable in our seats. And when we're comfortable, when we are 100% comfortable, the person in front of us becomes comfortable too. And that leads to the best interview. Great question. All right, who's got our next one? Yes, what's your name? Linda. Everyone, let's give Linda some love.
So since you've been in the situation of the kid who probably were worried that you were disappointing your parents, as parents, how do we support and not let our kids sense that they're disappointing us if they take a path that we wouldn't have chosen for them?
Linda, I feel like that question was planted by my mother. It's a really important question. And again, I'm not a parent myself, so I can only speak from the child perspective, the son perspective.
What would you have liked to hear from your mom during those early years?
It's a tricky question. I'll tell you why. Because on the one hand, the reason I am who I am is because of my mother. The reason I'm standing here is because of all the sacrifices she made, all of the challenging conversations we had. That's why I'm standing here. So on the one hand, a part of me doesn't want to change a thing because that's what made me who I am. That's what made me believe what I believe. And I am really grateful for my life, and it's because of her. On the other hand, and actually my mom and I have talked about this very recently, some of the most heartbreaking and terrifying moments of this entire journey, you think, going on this journey, the hardest parts, and again, in any business endeavor, we always like to focus on the external challenges. How am I going to get that account? How am I going to, market this new product? But we forget that those external challenges are half the battle. The harder half happens within you. And it's still, surprising to me on a very personal basis that when I look back at the people who said the harshest things about my dream, it was the people who loved me the most on this earth. And for a long time, that didn't make any sense to me. To the point where I didn't really think about it that much because I didn't know what to make of it. And only now, me and my mom's relationship is really wonderful right now, have we been able to talk about it. And my take on it is the only reason someone who truly loves you, whether it's a parent or a boss or a manager or a friend, the only reason someone who really loves you takes out the heavy artillery and starts shooting at you when you're actually trying to do something that makes you happy is because they are terrified themselves. They're terrified themselves. And what I wish, your question was what I would have wished my mother would have done at that time. What I would have wished is for her to have processed her fear, which is a normal fear, a fear that I probably can't even empathize until I have children of my own one day. But I would have wished she would have processed that fear, that natural, she came to America and sacrificed everything to give her kids an education, and here comes Alex thinking, I'm going to be an author, I would have wished, though, she would have processed her fear, outside, whether through a therapist, through a friend, in a journal, whatever she needed to do, so we could have had a healthy conversation and not one of yelling and tears where there wasn't a rational dialogue. And I'm really grateful now, though, me and my mom both, we both go to therapy now, we both journal now, and we're able to have really healthy dialogues now. And what I've also learned is it's never too late to go back in time and almost reconstruct those conversations, which me and my mom are doing now. Thank you. And who's got our next question? There he is. Everyone, one more time, a giant round of applause for Eric.
Thanks, Alex. So when I ask questions, I'll usually ask like 20 inside of one. So maybe you got that on the podcast interview. But I guess my question is, in this day and age of technology, we have Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all of these social platforms that exist. Your journey to getting to some of these folks that you interviewed, you know, there's probably some principles that exist outside of those technology platforms. As someone in business trying to seek, you mentioned just a second ago, a certain account to try to land some business, things like that. How do you distill the principles that you've learned writing this book to gain access to the folks that maybe you did? You've accessed them at the highest level. Certainly in our world of business, we're just trying to get to that next, you know, thing that we think is big. Maybe some words of advice there.
You know, that's your question really gets to the core of business. Because at the end of the day, whether it's sales or marketing or account management, it's essentially the same goal, which is how do you get the message and the idea you want into the minds and the hearts of someone else who you want to do business with, whether it's in a B2B way or a B2C way, right? So again, there's almost, you know, two different answers depending on if it's B2B or B2C. Because really when it comes, if you're doing direct business, let's say you want the, you know, the merchandising person at Walmart to really love your new product and put it on the shelves in a big way. It's almost a very specific focus there. You're really looking at one person or a group of people. Whereas if you're just marketing your product to the masses, it's a completely different approach. And we can talk about both. For you know, the first one, the B2B method, I think the challenge, and again, I would like you to be a bit more specific. Are you questioning how do you get into contact with someone you don't know, or let's say you already know them? Or I can go for both.
Yes, I think, you know, without burning all the social currency
Yeah.
that you might have with your connections.
Yeah, been there.
Yeah, right. Like, how do you not burn it all, or when do you choose to burn some of it, or something like that?
Yeah, so this is what I'll say. If there was one, and this is, again, the third door is literally all about this, but if I had to give a very specific tactical piece of advice, the biggest thing I've seen across the board is that when it comes to landing, you know, those really big deals, whether it was a big interview for myself personally, or it was, you know, Warren Buffett raising his first fund when he had no experience, there's always, in every single situation without exception, an inside man or an inside woman, an inside person who changed the dynamic. And what that means, you know, I'll give you an example. I'll tell you the story of how Steven Spielberg launched his career. So Spielberg, you know, ever since he was young, you know, his dream was to be a director. And, you know, when he became a teenager, he applied to film school and didn't get in. So he applied a second time and he still didn't get in. But of course, where most people stop, he decided to take his education into his own hands. And he decided to go to a, you know, local community college in Los Angeles. And he decided to, who here has been to Universal Studios in Los Angeles? Okay, great. For those who haven't been, there's this ride in the theme park called, you know, the tram ride. That actually takes you into the back lot of the movie studio. You can see, you know, Jaws and The Mummy and, you know, the sets of all the movies. And back then even, Spielberg went on that tram ride. And, you know, there's a lot of accounts of this story, but this is, you know, Spielberg's version of it. He went on that ride. The tram, you know, went around the back lot. He jumped off, hid in a bathroom, waited for the tram to drive away, and he started walking around the lot. And about an hour in, he bumped into an older gentleman who worked at Universal, and the man said, you know, he saw, you know, a 19-year-old kid here. He's like, what are you doing here? And Spielberg said the truth. You know, my biggest dream is to be a director. I was on the tram. I jumped off. And they ended up talking for about an hour. And that man was the head of the Universal Television Library, you know, the archives. And he said, look, how would you like to come back for the next 3 days? Spielberg goes, you know, that would be a dream. So the man, his name is Chuck Silvers. He wrote him a 3-day pass, and Spielberg came the first day and the second day and the third day, and on the fourth, he dressed up in a suit and carried his dad's briefcase, and he ended up walking right up to the security gate, you know, waving to the guard, saying, hey, Scotty. And the guard just waved back, and Spielberg walked right in. And he started doing this for months. He would sneak into sound stages, sneak into editing bays, essentially creating his own film school. He asked, directors and actresses out to lunch. But after a few months of this, Chuck Silvers slowly became a mentor to him and gave him some great advice. He said, look, there comes a point in everyone's life where you have to, stop schmoozing and create something of value to show people. Don't come back onto the lot until you have a short film that you're extremely proud of to show me. Spielberg took that very hard piece of advice to heart, and he spent the next few months, grueling, editing, and filming a short film called Amblin, a 22-minute film. And he finally went back to Chuck Silvers after months and months, showed him this short film. And it was so good, a teardrop came down Chuck Silvers' cheek. And Chuck Silvers reached for the phone and called the vice president of production of Universal Television, Sid Sheinberg, and said, Sid, I have something you got to see. And Sid Sheinberg's like, look, there's a lot of things I got to see. And Chuck Silvers says, no, this is that damn important. If you don't watch this, someone else will. And Sid Sheinberg says, all right, I'll watch it. And Chuck Silvers went even further, because this is back when they had projectionists. Chuck Silvers called the projectionist and said, look, make sure this is the first thing he sees tonight. And sure enough, he watched it that night. And Spielberg got a call the next morning saying he wants to be seen immediately at the Universal offices. And Spielberg shows up to the corner office, and on the table is a contract making him the youngest director in Hollywood history. Now, there's a lot of aspects to this story. Of course, undeniably, number one, Spielberg was incredibly talented. But so are a lot of other aspiring directors. And to me, the thing that made this story possible was Chuck Silvers. That inside man, that inside person. Anyone inside of the organization you want to get in, who believes in you enough, they're willing to put their reputation on the line to help you get in. And again, it doesn't matter if you're trying to land a big account, even if you're marketing to the masses. An inside man very much now in 2019 is an influencer in that industry. You want to launch a new fitness product? Who's the person in the fitness industry that has enough trust built in that can vouch for you? So that's, changed my understanding of, sales in a major way. Great question. And how are we looking on time? Perfect. We got time for 2 more questions. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Larry.
Everyone, let's give Larry some love. Very appropriate name for today.
Did the mafia give him more than 1%?
Did them? Yeah, to the Quincy Jones story. I'm trying to think. No, what ended up happening is Quincy Jones, the ending of that story was Quincy Jones still to this day only owns 1% of the publishing he made for that original composition. But the next time, a year later, when he needed to get an original composition, he decided to publish it himself and owns 100% of it now. Who's got our final question? Yes, sir. What's your name? Everyone, like he's our best friend. Let's give it up for Nate.
So I guess what you just said a few minutes ago, who or what was your inside man, and was there any internal struggles that you went through dealing with that person or getting started to go about like some of your interviews?
So, when you said, were there any internal struggles? My answer is like all the above, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you I'll give you probably the biggest example, which was in many ways, my biggest goal when I was starting out, which was getting that interview with Bill Gates. Because that's, similar what you just asked, what's in it for them? Bill Gates doesn't really need anything from an 18-year-old. And he doesn't need anything from anyone. And really, when it comes to an inside man, this is really where I learned the power of it. So, going back to Bill Gates, he was my holy grail interview. I was an 18-year-old wanting to write a book on success. Naturally, that was the person who I wanted to interview the most. And it took me a whole year of working to finally get in contact with Bill Gates' chief of staff. Because what I realized is that in Bill's life, there's Bill, there's Melinda, then there's the chief of staff. And spoiler alert, Bill doesn't make most of the decisions there. And I'm sure you've seen it in people of, all industries. When they reach a certain point, they really rely on the people closest to them to really validate potential projects and ideas. And, it took me a whole year to finally get a 5-minute phone call with Bill Gates' chief of staff. And he essentially told me in that phone call, he's like, look, we don't really do interviews with, random college students. Go get a publishing deal with either Penguin or Random House. Go build more momentum and call me back. So that set me off on this 8-month quest to get a publishing deal, which I thought, how hard could that be? And it took 8 months, but I finally was able to get a publishing deal with Random House. And I went back to Bill Gates' chief of staff and, told him, I got the publishing deal, and he responded, congratulations. And that was it. And I kid you not, I remember refreshing the email 3 times, thinking my browser wasn't loading the whole response. It took me 8 months to get this deal, and it was just congratulations with 1 exclamation mark. Sent from Outlook, I was like, something's not right here. And I, emailed him back a few times asking if, he would get on the phone again, and, there was no response, and I realized what the answer was still no. And then I, spent, another year, gathering more interviews. I went on that quest to get to Warren Buffett, with Larry King. And one of the things I learned from Larry King in my interview with him was that, and I'll never forget this piece of advice. I was sitting there at breakfast with Larry King, and he said, look, let me tell you what your generation doesn't understand. Yes, technology, I feel like a lot of people are a lot of things. He goes, look, yes, technology has changed rapidly over the past 50 years. Humanity has not. Humanity has not. We're still the same human beings. So even though the channels of communication are different, the human experience is the same. And it's not until you look at someone in their eyes can they really trust you. And only then will they want to work with you. And you would be surprised that for a 19-year-old who grew up literally, I was born in 92, I grew up on AOL. I was 6 years old, learning about the, AIM Messenger. That was a very novel thought. And I say that not jokingly. I say that in a very serious way that, even someone who wasn't born in 92, everyone in this room has been using email for, over a decade, maybe 2 decades. And sometimes we forget that at the end of the day, we're the same human beings as we were 2,000 years ago. Just our modes of communication are different. And Larry King helped me realize that I still was just a random name in Bill Gates' chief of staff's inbox. And if he was my inside man, because at that point I'd already learned that lesson through Spielberg, there's no way he would put his reputation on the line for a random name in his inbox. So I had just the idea. And this is a great story to, end today with. I realized Bill Gates and his chief of staff go to the TED conference. Everyone knows TED Talks, those videos. The TED conference was in Long Beach. I knew they go every year. So I realized if there's anywhere I could look in his eyes, it had to be the TED conference. So I had an inside man at Microsoft who was helping me as sort of a mentor, and I told him, look, I know you've already put a lot of your reputation on the line at this point, and it hasn't taken us anywhere, but if there's one final bullet, one final ask, I just want, 5 minutes with the chief of staff at TED. And we sent email after email after email for 2 weeks. No response. And then finally, I'll never forget this, the night before, at 7:47 p.m., I got a reply from the chief of staff. Yes, I'll be at TED, and yes, I'd be happy to meet with you. Now, he said he'll meet me the following morning at the coffee espresso bar after the opening session at 10:15. And I was like, perfect. I show up the next morning, I'm there at like 9:15. I'm there an hour early. And, this is the biggest, most important meeting at that point in my life. And, my entire journey leads to this moment. And, it's finally 10:15. I'm sitting at the lobby espresso bar at the very famous lobby espresso bar at the hotel across the street where, all the TED guests stay. I'm sitting at the espresso bar, sitting on this stool, and, the barista's like, sir, are you ready to order? I'm like, no, my guests will be coming in a few minutes. And, a few minutes pass by, and the barista's like, sir, are you ready to order? And I look up, and I see it's now 10:30. I'm like, no, I'm sure he's just running a bit late. Give me a couple more minutes. And I'm just watching, the spinning door of the hotel. Finally, I look up at the clock. It's now 10:50, and the chair to me is still empty. And it started to dawn on me what was happening. And, I tried to, hold it together, and I looked up in my email the assistant for the chief of staff. She had her phone number and her email signature, so I thought I would just give her a call to just make sure everything's okay. And I gave her a call. Her name is Wendy, and I call her. I'm like, hey, Wendy, it's Alex Banayan. Look, I'm super grateful. The chief of staff even said he would be willing to meet. Again, I'm really, really appreciative. I just wanted to make sure that if everything's okay, because it's been almost, 40 minutes now, and he hasn't shown up. And she said, what are you talking about? He told me you didn't show up. I'm like, that's impossible. And that's when I found out there's 2 espresso bars. And I was at the wrong one. Yes, that is correct. And I literally am on the phone with Wendy, trying my best to hold back the tears, but I just couldn't. And I start telling her everything I've been through the past 2 years to get to this point, and I'm just like, just pouring my heart out to her. And she's like, Alex, give me a few minutes. Let me see what I can do. 10 minutes later, I get an email from Wendy saying the chief of staff has agreed to meet me in the afternoon and let me ride in his limo on the way to the airport. So my 5-minute meeting is now a 45-minute meeting. And this time I knew, they said to meet him at the valet of the hotel. And thank God I knew there was only one valet at this hotel. So, they told me to, meet him at, 4 p.m. And sure enough, one of the people who I had actually met along the journey was the CEO of Zappos, Tony Hsieh. And Tony is very well known for having an RV that he takes to the TED conference every year and parks it out front. And I had met Tony, once or twice before on my journey, and I, send him an email telling him the situation, like, you can sit on the RV and hang out and watch, the live stream of the conference there. I was like, oh, perfect. So, I had like 5 hours, between the morning and the afternoon. I was like, great. And, I definitely was not going to be late. So, I set my alarm. I was supposed to meet him at 4. I set my alarm for like 3:30, 3:45, 3:50. The valet, I traced my steps, was only, 90 seconds away from the RV. Nothing was going to go wrong this time. And, I'm sitting in the RV. It's, around, it's like 3:15 now, 3:20, and I'm watching the conference on the live stream. I'm sitting in this, essentially a tour, very fancy tour bus on a couch, and someone walks in. And it's this older gentleman, with white hair. He sort of has a round belly, and the sun is shining behind him, so I can't really see who it is. And he comes in, sits down on the couch beside me, and I realize this is Richard Saul Warman, the founder of the TED Conference. And he looks up, and he's like, "You, what do you think of this thing?" And he's like pointing to the live stream. And I'm like, wait, the founder of TED is asking me what I think of his conference. So, I started like telling him what I think, and then he launches into the whole story of how he started the TED conference. And this guy is like the wisdom pinata. The second you crack it, all the gold is on the floor. And, he's also, something you have to understand about him, he talks 100 miles per hour. And he literally has the most, incredible, piece of advice, but he's just going and going. He's like, "You want to know the secret, young man? You still think you know enough. You won't get anywhere until anything." And then he's like, "You want to know why I never use slides when I speak? Because when you use slides during a presentation, you become the caption to the photo. Never be a caption, young man." He's just going 100 miles an hour. Half the things he say, like, I don't understand at all, but I just know they're right. And all of a sudden, I just hear my phone going, and I'm like, shoot. But this guy keeps talking. I'm like, okay, I know I set an early alarm. I'll just wait until he takes a breath. Like, I'll just hit snooze this one time. I take out my phone, and I hit snooze. And he just keeps going and going and going and going. And again, I hear, I'm like, shoot. Like, I can't walk out on the founder of TED. Okay, I just have to hit snooze like this one more time. And I hit snooze again. And he's just going, and this is like an express train, no local stops. And he's like, "Genius is the opposite of expectation." And I look at him, and again, he is not taking a single breath. And I just jump up, and I'm like, I might regret this one day, but I have to go. And I just run off the bus before he can say anything. And I am now sprinting down the sidewalk, running to the valet. I finally get there. There's like sweat patches under my arm. And I look at my phone, and I'm there with 1 minute to spare. And, the chief of staff isn't there yet, but, the limo, the town car is there. And, I meet the driver, and I'm just sort of standing there looking at the front door to the hotel. And, right on time, the chief of staff walks out. He has like thick black hair and Ray-Bans and a blazer. He looks like Bill Gates' chief of staff. And, he lowers his glasses and he goes, "You must be Alex. Come on." It's like very surreal. And, we get into his car, and, it takes off. And the chief of staff is like, "So, how's the progress been on your project?" And I used to always carry in my wallet a little note card with all of the people I wanted to interview with blue, actually it was green check marks, the people I had already interviewed, and almost to keep myself inspired. And I take out the note card and I show it to him, and he's going down reading each one almost like a report card. He's like, Larry King, very good. Maya Angelou. Dean Kamen. And something about it just felt so off, and I just looked at him and I'm like, it's not about the names. He looks at me very confused. I just look at him again. I was like, it's not about the names. I just believe that if all these people come together, not for press, not to promote anything, but really just to share their best wisdom with the next generation, young people can do so much more. And he's like, "That's it. I've heard enough." And I think he's like going to throw me out to the curb. He's like, "I've heard enough. We're in." And a month later, I found myself sitting in Bill Gates' office. So your question was really how I got that inside man, and that was the ultimate inside man. And I'll finish up. I'll wrap up with one final thought. When I had started this journey, my original intention was for it to, be the most, practical, wisdom packed book I could possibly make it. I wanted to stuff as much knowledge into 300 pages as I possibly could. And in some ways that happened to a degree. In the book is Bill Gates' negotiating secrets and Tim Ferriss's cold email template. And it's only now, though, that the book is out that I can see in hindsight that was never the point of this mission. It's only now can I see that the soul of the third door is really about possibility. If there's one thing I've learned over the past 7 years, it's that you can give someone all the best tools and knowledge in the world, and their life can still feel stuck. But if you change what someone believes is possible, they'll never be the same. And there's this one story that I came across somewhere in my research. I can't even remember where I read it, but it's this story of this teacher who's teaching for Teach for America. And she was assigned to a school in Baltimore, and a really rough part of town, a really tough school. And she's assigned to, I think, maybe 3rd or 4th grade, so the kids are about 8 years old. And she realizes these kids need some inspiration. So she says, all right, today instead of our math lesson, we're all going to draw pictures of our biggest dream in life. What we want to be when we grow up. She passes out the papers to all the little kids, and they all start coloring. There's one boy sitting in the back of the class. His face is blank. He won't pick up a crayon. But about, 15 minutes in, his eyes light up and he starts coloring. And at the end of the day, the teacher collects all the papers and the kids go home. And the teacher's going through them, and she sees that the young boy drew a picture of a pizza delivery man. And the teacher was very concerned that night. So she called the mother. And the mother said that she wasn't surprised. The mother said that the only male figure in his life who isn't in jail or on drugs is his uncle who delivers pizza. And what I learned from that story is that young people will always reach for the highest branch they believe is possible. They will always reach for the highest branch they think is possible. So it's our jobs, whether it's families, schools, or society at large, to illuminate more branches. And that's the mission moving forward. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you.